that this class is being recorded, will be posted in the next couple of days. We have added a link to the documents that she is using today, and they will also be in that same place where the recording is found. So Sister Ward, I will stop sharing and turn the time over to you.
All right, good afternoon. Today's presentation is the third in a four-part series on Scottish research. Today's topic is what official records exist about your Scottish ancestors, searching Scotland government records. Parts 1 and 2 were presented July 8th and 15th and were recorded. Previous topics were UK geography, Scottish census records, church records, and old parish records. So if you'd like to watch any of those, you can find them in the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, as well as in our classes archive on the BYU Family History website. And I've listed these links in my handout. All right, by way of introduction, my name's Erika Ward, and I'm happy to be with you today. I've been a genealogist most of my life, thanks to an early introduction by my mom, who loved chasing down her ancestors. This is me last April at the BYU Family History Library, celebrating the release of the 1950 US Census by dressing up for the occasion. We all dressed up in 50s clothing, and it was a super fun day. On the right here is my oldest son with his family visiting gravestones in 2018 in Ohio, right after their first son, my oldest grandson, was born. This was in Westlake, Ohio, where many of my maternal ancestors are buried. I'm hoping to pass along my love of genealogy to the next generation and beyond, hopefully. My Scottish knowledge background, as was discussed by Elder Farnsworth, is primarily from my studies at the University of Strathclyde based in Glasgow, Scotland. I hold a postgraduate certificate in genealogical, paleographic, and heraldic studies. So it's kind of a mouthful. So when I tell people this, I usually get a lot of questions about the course. So since Strathclyde has such great options for learning about Scottish genealogy, I always like to review a couple of details about the courses they offer. All right, so through their Center for Lifelong Learning, Strathclyde offers 8-week beginner and intermediate genealogy classes online that you can take from the comfort of your home. These range, as you can see from this list, from beginning family history research to genetic genealogy and DNA. And because it's based in Scotland, a lot of this introduction stuff, you're going to learn quite a bit about Scottish records and UK records in general. I want to highlight one text used in the introduction class. It's called Discover Your Scottish Ancestry, Internet and Traditional Resources by Graham Holton and Jack Winch. And it's a great resource for learning more about Scottish genealogy as well. I've listed a link to this book in the handout in case you're interested in getting a copy. All right, next up, Strathclyde has the more advanced programs. These are structured as a 3-part online master's degree program. The PG Cert deals primarily with researching in Scotland, England, and Wales, and provides a grounding in theory and practice of genealogical research, including paleography, which is the study of old handwriting, and heraldry, which relates to the display and study of coats of arms, armorial achievements, rank, and pedigree. The PG diploma builds on the postgraduate certificate, focusing on the social and historical contexts of genealogical work, and includes a 5,000-word research project. The master's degree year provides the opportunity to research an individual topic of interest and write a 12,000 to 16,000-word dissertation about it. Really looking forward to that. You can complete this entire master's degree or any of the introductory classes online, and you can do these. You can start and stop at any point along the way, and you can do it at part-time, full-time, or modular, which is what I'm doing, which is a much more relaxed pace. All right, so if you're interested in any of these courses, I encourage you to take a look at their website, or feel free to reach out to me with questions. And I put their website and information in the handout. All right, so today's topic. Today we'll be covering the following. We're going to talk about civil records in Scotland. Sometimes I'll say government records. Sometimes I might say statutory records, which means like the state. And sometimes I'll say civil records. So these are all just words that help us differentiate them from church or census records. So they're all kind of interchangeable the way I'm using them today. Today we will start with a brief history of the early national records and the challenges faced by Scottish record keepers throughout the centuries. Next, I'll introduce you to records related to civil registration in Scotland. And third, we'll chat about a really special year. It's 1855, and it's a very significant date to Scottish civil registration records. Then we'll go over some practical information on where to find all of these records and how to start working with them. And we'll do a few examples. We'll follow that up by a brief summary and conclusion and any questions that you might have. Okay, history of the National Archives. So the early history of Scotland and their records reflects Scotland's own troubled history. As many of you probably know, there's a lot of wars and conflicts in Scotland in the early days. Many records were lost as a result of being taken out of the country, first in the 13th century by Edward I during the Wars of Independence, and later by Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. When war broke out between Scotland and England in 1296 and Edward I invaded, he had all the symbols of Scots nationhood, the regalia, the National Archives, and the Stone of Destiny removed to London. In 1329, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton ended the First War of Independence and provided for the return of the records to Scotland. But despite it being provided for, the records remained in London, where many of them disappeared. And when their remnants were finally sent back to Scotland, many years later, only about 200 of these old documents remained. Over the next couple of centuries, relative stability meant that new records began to accumulate. So by the mid-16th century, it became necessary to build a special register house in Edinburgh Castle to house these many records. The archives remained safe here in the castle until 1650, when Oliver Cromwell's new model army entered Scotland after the Scottish Parliament had declared Charles II their king. The defending forces were no match for Cromwell's army of well-trained and well-provisioned professional soldiers. The Scots suffered severe losses as the city and the castle of Edinburgh fell. Luckily, after its capture, the Scots were allowed to remove the state archives and legal papers and move them to Stirling Castle for safekeeping. But the precious archive was not safe for long. Less than a year later, Stirling Castle also fell to the English. In August 1651, Cromwell's military commander, General Monk, laid siege to Stirling Castle. Monk set up artillery around the castle, including in a nearby churchyard, whence for 3 days a fire was kept up, causing considerable damage to the castle. But when Stirling Castle fell, no provision was made to allow them to save their records. Monk's garrison carried off their spoils of war, which included the Earl of Mar's coronet and robes, and while the Scottish clerks were able to rescue some of the records, most of the national records of Scotland were sent away to the Tower of London. Cromwell may have wanted to have all the records of his new Commonwealth in one archive, or he may have wished to demonstrate his power over a subjugated nation. But either way, it became near impossible to resolve any legal cases in Scotland with all of the records in England. So permission was finally granted for 1,600 volumes of legal papers to return to Scotland. The state records and remaining papers followed after the restoration of Charles II in 1660, and arrangements were made for these records to come back to Edinburgh. However, in 1651, one of 2 ships carrying archives back to Scotland sank in a storm off the Northumbrian coast, leading to the destruction of all the papers and parchments on board. Amongst the cargo aboard the ship Elizabeth of Burnt Island were 85 hogshead barrels containing almost 2 tons of papers, including legal charters and records dating back to the reign of Robert the Bruce and David II, as well as parliamentary papers from the 15th and 16th centuries. This left a hole in the Scottish historical archives to this day. Those records that did survive this voyage north were deposited again in Edinburgh Castle. But in 1662, the legal registers were transferred to the Leigh Hall below Parliament Hall on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, where parliamentary and other records from the castle joined them in 1689. The move was partly designed to promote access to the records, as it was housed in the same space as the Advocates' Library. But this accommodation proved to be far from satisfactory, and the archives were damaged by moisture and rodents. Records were piled on the floor, and the backs of cupboards ran with damp. The records housed in the Parliament Hall had a narrow escape in the Great Fire of 1700. It started at 11 p.m. on the 3rd of February in a court of houses occupied mostly by lawyers. The fire extended rapidly uphill to involve the tall tenements on the south and east sides of the square. One of these, that was 15 stories high, the tallest building in Edinburgh, was reduced to a heap of ashes and made a prodigious blaze. Witness to the event, Duncan Forbes of Culloden wrote in a letter to his brother that he never beheld a more vehement fire, that 400 families were burned out, and that from the Cowgate upwards to the High Street, scarcely one stone was left upon another. The Parliament House very hardly escaped, he said. All registers confounded, clerks, chambers, and processes in such a confusion by reason of the disorder. This fire forced a temporary removal of the records to St. Giles's Church for safety. This and other fires in the same square put the records of Scotland much at risk and highlighted the need for a more secure location. However, there was no public money available to provide adequate accommodation and supervision for them. By the mid-18th century, the need to provide a permanent accommodation for the National Archives was widely recognized. In 1765, a grant was obtained towards building a proper repository. A site was chosen, and the foundation stone from local quarries was laid in 1774. Sadly, the building was left an empty shell when work ceased 5 years later due to protracted delays and soaring costs. This incomplete building, which was described as the most magnificent pigeon house in Europe, was the haunt of thieves and pickpockets. The Scotland just can't get a break with their records, can they? But thankfully, construction resumed in 1785, and finally, General Register House was completed in 1788. This is a neoclassical building on Princes Street in Edinburgh, and it's one of the oldest custom-built archive buildings that's still in continuous use in the world, and it's headquarters to the National Archives of Scotland. New Register House was built about 75 years later near the old Register House to hold all the civil registers and as a place for the public to view them. Acquired in 1856, the building was completed in 1864, and this new site close to St. Andrew's Square on the east end of Princes Street in the new town of Edinburgh houses the registration side of the former General Record Office of Scotland's business. The registers are kept in duplicate, one copy held by the local registrar, one sent to the Registrar General. Annual indexes are compiled for each register, and fees are charged for consulting them and for obtaining extracts, with the exception of the first extract, which is supplied at the time of someone's civil registration. The new Register House is also home to the Court of Lord Lion, Scotland's heraldic authority, which is responsible for conservation and digitization of the public register of all coats of arms and armorial bearings in Scotland. All right, moving on to civil registration. So as was discussed in our previous session, initially ministers of the Church of Scotland were primarily responsible for keeping parish records of baptisms and marriages, but only for their own church members. A growing interest in social reform and the use of statistics as a means of understanding and controlling social change was one of the forces driving the move to civil registration. But Scotland lagged behind the rest of Western Europe, which largely followed the system introduced by the Emperor Napoleon in France in 1804, which had stripped away the responsibility of registration from the churches and given it to the state. The Privy Council of Scotland, following advice from many other organizations and the suggestion of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, enacted that all parish ministers should keep a record of baptisms, burials, and marriages. So this situation worked fairly well until 1854, when finally, after several more failed bills in the 1840s, an act to provide for the better registration of births, deaths, and marriages in Scotland was passed. This started the system of civil registration in Scotland and transferred such responsibility to the Scottish government. The Registration Act of 1854 created the General Registrar Office for Scotland, GROS, and a network of local registrars in every civil parish under a Registrar General for Scotland. The parochial and borough divisions in Scotland were adopted as the basis of registration, and the session clerks of the Church of Scotland were in most cases appointed as the first registrars under the Act, which soothed the point of major opposition held by the Church of Scotland, which was loath for its session clerks to lose their status and income, which was provided by registering people. So existing session clerks were the local registrars initially, but thereafter they were appointed by the local parochial boards or in the boroughs by the town councils. Where the parish or borough was too large for a single registrar, a sheriff was empowered to divide it into districts. So these registers were, as I mentioned earlier, produced in duplicate. One was kept locally, and another copy was sent on to the office of the Scottish Registrar General in Edinburgh. This proves to be super handy for us as genealogists because all of the records from all over the country were all sent to one location, which is really great when we're used to, for any of you who are used to doing United States research, when civil registration is in all the different states and different places. This is all in one centralized location. Compulsory civil registration officially started 1st of January 1855. And within the next few years, two amending acts appointed registration district examiners to inspect the registers and make revised provision for the transmission of all the parochial registers or the church records previous to 1855, also to the custody of the local registrars, who would keep records newer than 30 years and pass the rest onto the General Register Office in Scotland. Again, this is asking all of the churches all over Scotland to send copies of their all of their previous to 1855 church registration records to a central location. So it's one thing very unique about Scotland research is that all of the records were sent and housed, in one main central location. Registration was free, and false registration could be punished by imprisonment or transportation to the penal settlements in the colonies. Thus, compliance was fairly quick and complete for marriages and deaths. However, birth registration took rather longer to become routine, and it wasn't until 1861 that the first Registrar General for Scotland in 1861 wrote, "There is good reason for believing that very few births indeed now escape registration." So from 1855 to 1861, birth registrations could be a little bit spotty, but after 1861, almost everything was being registered civilly. So food for thought. Why do you suppose that birth registrations took longer to be fully compliant with the new law? If you have any ideas, feel free to type them into the chat. I was thinking about this myself. And Sister Esplin, if anybody has any ideas, let me know. I was like, why would marriages and deaths be compliant like almost immediate, but births take longer? So one idea that I had was that if you think about the situation, if you're going to get married, those people getting married would need to interact with some kind of an official for a license and for the marriage itself. So it'd be pretty easy for that to become registered. With deaths, again, Obviously, someone official would know about the death when it came time to do the burial in the cemetery. However, with a birth, since many were taking place in homes, no one official might even know about a baby's birth. They didn't have Facebook back then. So until they took the baby to be baptized by a minister, or if they knew about the law and wished to be compliant, it may not have been reported. So today it seems logical to us to want a birth certificate because it's needed for so much. But it took half a decade for the people there to understand the purpose of it and not just feel like the government was trying to impose upon their lives. All right, so on April 1st of 2011, the General Register Office for Scotland, or I'm sorry, I think I said the wrong date. On April 1st of 2011, the General Register Office for Scotland, or GROS, was merged with the National Archives of Scotland, with which it already had close ties. And these had shared management of the Scotland's People Centre in Princes Street, Edinburgh. Together, these two entities formed the National Records of Scotland, or NRS, which is still with us today. All of the former department's functions continue as part of the new body. So this National Records of Scotland holds all of these records that we've been discussing that were sent to the primary location. All right, so the types of records kept by the National Records of Scotland that would be of interest to us as genealogists are the old parish records, which we discussed in part 2 of the series, civil registration of all births, deaths, and marriages in Scotland since 1855, the Adopted Children's Register since 1930, divorce records since 1984, civil partnership, gender recognition, and dissolutions since 2005, and available census records from 1841 to 1911, which is discussed in part 1 of our series. So, as well as various miscellaneous records. And as you can imagine, some of the purposes of civil registration are to give a person a name and an identity within society, to offer a facility for marriage and civil partnership, to give evidence of parentage and entitlement to inheritance. And further, this registration facilitates delivery of benefits and government services. All right, part 3, we are going to talk about 1855. So as you probably remember from what we just discussed, 1855 was a pretty important year for civil records because the 1854 Registration Act had specified many details to be entered into the register. Fuller details were recorded in these registers than many other countries have. In fact, so much information was asked for to begin with that it was soon realized that too much was being asked of the registrars to keep up with. So acts were passed to reduce the detail of information required. Too bad for genealogists. But as a researcher, if you're lucky enough to come across a record from 1855, it will include some of the following extra information. So the 1855 birth registers include parental ages and birthplaces and number of other children of parents. The 1855 death registers include the place of birth of the deceased, the length of stay in the district where the death took place, the names and ages of any children, and the place of burial and name of undertaker. You can see how valuable this could be. And 1855 marriage registers include the birthplaces of both the bride and the groom and the number of children by former marriages. You may also find things such as whether the individuals could write or not, noting signature or marks, and whether there was a second, third marriage, etc. The church denomination in which the marriage was solemnized helps provide a clue about where to look for earlier records as well. So if you're lucky enough to get an 1855 record, you'll be in luck. All right, so post 1855. Although we love the 1855 records, it's not super common to be able to get one from that year. But all of the post 1855 records still contain a wealth of information when compared to records from many other countries. Information you can expect to find in most post 1855 civil records include the following. In birth records, you're going to get first and last name of the baby, date and time of birth, place of birth, including the address, the father's name, rank, and occupation, the mother's names, both maiden and former married name, which is a huge boon to finding the mother's parents. And sometimes you'll be lucky and get an occupation for the mother as well. They may include the date and place of parents' marriage, which is often recorded, but not always. And then, of course, you'll have the regular data, such as signatures, informant's role and address, and the date the entry was created and the name of the registrar. Names could be inserted into the register up to 6 months after the registration if name hadn't been chosen at the time of the registration happening, or if there were any changes made to the name. But after that, the sheriff's written authority was required to insert a name. So some children were not born in buildings. You may find locations such as a caravan on Glasgow Green noted in the records. Those are always kind of fun. The precise time of birth was very important in the case of twins and is usually recorded. So great information. All right, illegitimacy. This would usually, children that were born illegitimately or before the parents were married, or whether they were not married, would usually have its mother's surname. So the child could only have its father's surname if both father and mother requested it, and both signed the register as informants of the birth. If the child was later legitimized by the marriage of its parents, which is a feature in Scots law, then that fact was usually noted in the margin of the birth entry by RCE, or Register of Corrected Entities, or I'm sorry, Register of Corrected Entries. Illegitimacy was until 1919 recorded on a person's death registration entry, so it followed them throughout their life. Stillborn children. Since 1939, there's been a separate register for stillbirths. It is closed to the public, and extracts are issued only in exceptional circumstances. Pre-1939, stillbirths were not recorded in either the birth or death registers. However, children who breathed for only moments were recorded in both. Adoption. It was not legally recognized in Scotland until 1930, but has always occurred informally. So informal adoptions were often not recorded, but where one was known, the local registrar might record the matter. The child's original surname would have remained unaltered on their birth registration entry in these cases. So the Adopted Children Register runs from 1930, but contains no information on persons born before October of 1909. Extracts from this register can be requested from the NRS. The link between a birth entry and an adoption entry is kept strictly confidential, but if you are the person in question, you can request this information. Marriage records. Information contained within marriage records includes year, day of month, place, and mode of celebration, the names of the parties, the rank, profession, or occupation of everyone possible on the record, relationships, if they're related, condition, which means they'll put bachelor or spinster for unmarried men and women, and widow or widower if they were previously married. The ages of the parties will be noted, the usual residence of the parties, often with an address, the names of parents and their rank, their occupation, or the profession of the fathers. You'll also see the signature of officiating minister and at least 2 witnesses, which often will be the signature of one of the parents, which is really neat to see original signatures. And of course, date of registration. Don't forget to note down the place where the events took place and the names of witnesses, because they could be family members or close neighbors. All right, divorce records. The records of most of them are listed or indexed in some way and are relatively accessible, except for a 100-year viewing limitation due to privacy issues. In Scotland, a married woman traditionally retained her maiden name. So in the indexes and records, she may be designated as, by her maiden name, or it could say maiden name, wife of and then her husband's name. But the NRS holds most of these divorce proceedings. All right, death records. You'll get names of deceased, rank, profession, or occupation, condition, and names of any spouses, the year, day, and month and hour when the death took place, the name and place of the death, the age, names, rank, profession, and occupation of the parents on the death certificate, cause of death, signatures of the informant, and date of registration and signature of the registrar. All right, so some issues with death records, which is always an issue in any country, is that the informant isn't always somebody who actually knows all of this information. So they might have been uncertain about the names of the parents of the deceased or the occupations of the parents of the deceased. So just, and or even the age, if it was like a neighbor reporting it. So just always kind of take with a grain of salt things about early life on death records, where the things that happened more closely to the death, like the cause of death, can be taken as pretty reliable. All right, lastly, the register of corrected entries, as we mentioned just a bit ago. Sometimes alterations had to be made to the records, and there could be errors or changes in the information. So rather than changing it on the original register, you'll see a little note that says something about an RCE, and then you can go download that as a separate image, a separate record, and get more information. And often it'll talk about why it was changed. So I've found some really interesting information that way. All right, finally, we are going to talk about how to access these registers. As many of you probably know, the Family Search website contains a certain amount of transcribed information from statutory registers, birth and marriage only for Scotland, into databases. The Scotland marriages 1561 to 1910 and Scotland births and baptisms 1564 to 1955. Typically, this data will include a name, a place, and a date. There might be some more information, but it is all extracted by an indexer. These databases are similar at Find My Past and Ancestry, and these databases are also not complete. So, for example, the births and baptisms database only holds civil registration for births for 20 years, between 1855 to 1875, and it's unclear what percentage of total registrations are included. So while these three sites can be very useful in getting some initial information, it's really important with Scotland research to go outside of these databases to jump right in directly to Scotland research. So the best place for this is online at Scotland's People. So images are available from 1855 for registrations, though there's the 50 to 100 year embargo on viewing some of these images, and we'll talk about those more in just a minute. But for ones that are more recent than that, you can order an extract of the record through the website. All right, so if you're able to go in person, if you're thinking you're going to Scotland soon, you may want to visit the Scotland People Centre in Edinburgh, or the Registrar Centre in Glasgow, or the other centres around Scotland, because they offer direct access to the databases for a daily fee of £15. So it's a very economical way to look at records if you're already there. The Dundas Search Room in the Scotland's People Centre has reopened for all customers with a restricted number of seats, so you have to make sure to get an appointment. But this would cost you less per record than online. At local registrar offices, you can also find information possibly about local archive services, as well as old parish records and other church records. So that's always worth checking into if you are visiting some of the places where your ancestors live. But unless you're planning a trip to Scotland sometime soon, your best bet is to use a combination of these indexes and original records. So let's walk through how to access a couple of these. All right, so in order to search the Scottish databases on Family Search, you'll first want to go to familysearch.org, click on Search, and then Records. At this point, you'll land on the Search Historical Records page. For those of you who are here for the Church Records lecture, this will look familiar. At this point, you'll scroll down until you see a section called Find a Collection. This is where you can search for the Scottish databases by simply typing the word Scotland into the search bar. As you type, you'll see a list of options pop up. And surprise of surprises for me when I was putting this together, but there is a bigger list here than when I did this just 2 weeks ago. So, and I didn't, in this image, I wasn't able to capture all of them because you have to scroll down. But there's all these Scotland censuses showing up on there now. So that's kind of interesting and something to check out. All right, hang on just a second. I need just a slight drink here. Okay. So always check back over time if you haven't been able to find what you were looking for the first time around, because you just never know when new things are being added. All right, so when you type in Scotland, you're going to see all these different options. And the two that we're looking for today here are these Scotland births and baptisms, 1564 to 1950, and Scotland marriages, 1561 to 1910. So do you all remember that important date we talked about with civil registration? 1855, right? So you can see that in both of these databases, you've got dates older than that as well. So you're going to have a mix of indexes here of parish records as well as civil records. So that's kind of handy to understand. So once you decide on which collection you'd like to view, you click on it and you will land on that collections page. So for example, if we click on Scotland births and baptisms, we'll land here. Notice the text about the collection under the title. It says index to selected Scotland births and baptisms. Only a few localities are included and the time period varies by locality. Due to privacy laws, recent records may not be displayed. The year range represents most of the records and a few records may be earlier or later. So this is just a reminder that just because you don't find your Scottish ancestor in this database doesn't mean that there's not a record for them. It just means it's not in this particular collection. So it's really important to read things like this when you are starting in a search. Look at this information about the collection because it's going to give you some really important information that will help you know what you can and can't see in this collection. For some more specific information, you would click on the yellow How to Use This Collection button, which will take you to a page that gives you a bunch more information. So I always recommend that you have a look at this before you start using a collection. There's also a handy spot here where you can click to copy the citation so you can keep track of where you found your information. So these two things, looking at what is contained in the collection as well as making a note of your citation, are really important. You'll have so much more success if you understand the record set and if you keep track of where you find your information. Way too much time in genealogical research is spent going around in circles on the same website simply because we don't keep a research log because we're too excited and we just want to click to the next thing. But it's so important to keep track of what's been done and what's not been done. So once you feel ready and for doing your search, you can go ahead and do that with information that you know right here at the top right. Remember to always use less information at first and then narrow down your results if needed, if you get too many results. So remember, all these database collections are extractions from original records, and they're to be used as clues since mistakes can happen during extracting and indexing. In this case, I did a search for the name John McCleary and came up with 157 results. Notice how this is specifically filtered, you can see right there, by the collection, which is why I like to go in this way through records rather than just starting with a name search on the beginning. It gives me that opportunity to record where I'm looking, to understand the collection, as well as to just get it automatically filtered for me So let's see. So the first three results here, you'll notice that you've got 1854, you've got 1859, and you've got 1870. So since this John McCleary was born in 1854, which was just barely before 1855, that important date when civil registration started, plus it's a christening, this tells us that it's a parish record, not a civil record. So just important to know, it's going to be a little bit different type of information. Okay, because in these civil records, like these two, which are both after 1855, you're going to get, more of that information. Obviously, if you're searching before 1855, you're going to happily want to go look at the old parish records. All right, so excuse me, in this case, I clicked on that middle John McCleary, born in 1859 in Glasgow, Lanarkshire, Scotland. So note something interesting here. It says original birthplace is Bridgeton, Glasgow, Lanark, Scotland, even though birthplace above just says Glasgow. So we're having a little bit of more detail on this original birthplace. Often dates and birthplaces, will be standardized in family search. And so knowing what originally was written on the record is important to keep track of, because that can give us a little bit more specific information. So we see here that John's parents are Henry McCleary and Ellen Gemmell, which is a pretty good amount of information right here. So just in family search, I was able to find quite a bit of information. Once you found the person you're looking for, you'll want to add any of your newly discovered information to your records and use that information to search for other records, such as marriage, death, or other census records. The more events you can find for each person in the family, the more complete of a picture you'll create and the less chance you'll have of mistakes and duplicates, because it will become obvious when people are not in that particular family. So speaking of pictures, note that on the left it says image unavailable. So keep in mind, since we're here on family search, due to Scotland's privacy laws, the only place you can legitimately get images of the original records is from the National Registers of Scotland through their website, Scotland's People. So let's go have a look at Scotland's People to see what we can find, because we might find more information than we have here in this index. All right, so since Scotland's People has all those records from the National Records of Scotland, it's the most reliable place to search for civil records, well, any records of your Scotland ancestors. So it has the ability to search all of the indexes for all the records that they have made available. So Scotland's People is a wonderful resource, but it can be a little expensive to use, especially if copies of the original records are wanted. So all statutory register images on Scotland's People are available for viewing and downloading, but for a fee. So you need to purchase credits that expire after 2 years, and the size of the image will determine how many credits need to be spent for each one. Note that you can search the indexes for free. Credits are only needed for viewing or ordering original records. So these images of the original register pages, which are restricted as follows for internet research: 100 years for births, 75 years for marriages, and 50 years for deaths. So anything more recent than that, you won't be able to get an image published online on the Scotland's People website. However, you will be able to search the indexes for these more recent records and can have the opportunity to order official certificates if you would like. The last time I was presenting about Scotland's People, I was asked why these need to be paid for. So just remember that this site belongs to the Scottish government, and Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, other sites can only make available for free what they are allowed by Scottish law. So currently, those consist of indexed databases and transcriptions, not original records. All right, so in order to access civil registration on Scotland's People, you're going to click on Search Our Records at the top left of any page on Scotland's People, which will bring you here to this Search Our Records page. Next, click on Advanced People Search down here, and where you will go through the next steps. Note that statutory registers is the default record category in advanced search, so it should already be highlighted. Below that, you will see the option to choose your record type. In this case, we're going to choose births because, here we go. Oh, statutory registers. We're going to choose births because I'd like to see if we can find the John McCleary that we found on Family Search. Once we click births, the page scrolls down to here. At this point, you're going to enter what you know about your person of interest using general search terms at first. So you can always get more detailed later if you need to. Always remember that if you get too detailed up front, you may filter out your person and not be able to find them. This can be because of misspellings or problems in the indexed records, or just making it so specific that it just, for whatever reason, doesn't come up. So just start general is a really good rule of thumb. All right, so note here that the surname comes first, and then the forename, which is your given name. So I'm going to use the info I know about John McCleary from Family Search. This is a little image of what we just found. And so we're going to put in McCleary, John, male, and then for year range, I like to do a 10-year range on either side of the date. And since it was 1859, I'm going to do 1869 as the later date, but I'm going to just put 1855 in the earlier one because these are civil records, so you can't search before 1855. All right, I'm not going to put locations or any of the other information down here because I feel like that will get a little bit too specific. And also, since there was this difference with the birthplace and the original birthplace, I want to, if you're not familiar with what's going on here, it's good to just leave that blank initially and see if you happen to get a limited number with just your date and name information. So we're going to click on search and we'll land here. Woohoo! 2 results. This was very surprising because as I did with the previous series, I picked this name randomly on Family Search. So this just happened to be what I found on this person. And when I came to Scotland's People, I was thrilled to find it and to find it so quickly because with only 2 results, one of them has to be him, right? So let's look. So one of the places, this RD name is registration district name. So when I first looked at this, I was like, neither of these are Glasgow, but wait a minute, what was that original place of birth that we had looked up? Oh yeah, it was Bridgeton. So good thing we had that information because there we go, Bridgeton. So this is probably our guy. And if we start looking at this other information, we've got the year 1859, his name, the right town, and there's not really any other options. This other person is like almost a decade later, so, and in a different place. So this is probably our guy. So I'm going to go ahead and get my mouse to go off of my page. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and click on buy credits. Now, I usually keep credits in my account on Scotland's People because I'll just here and there buy images, but I had actually gotten down to only 4. So I thought I'd just show you when you go ahead and get credits. I picked the package that's 30 credits for £7.50. And so that equates to roughly $9.12 as of the exchange rate of today. The payment is done through a company called World Pay, and it's pretty slick through the website. It lets you use a Visa card or other credit card through it, and I've never had any issues with their system. So not too costly for $9 to get that many credits. So it's only going to take, once I've purchased enough credits, it will say view image 6 credits. So I know that that's how many I'll need. So not bad, because that will still leave me with 38 left over in my account for other projects. So I love how when you click on view image 6 credits, it always gives you a warning confirming that you want to spend credits. So it will help you to not accidentally spend money when you're not wanting to. All right, so I click on OK, and here it is. As you can see here, we have a whole bunch more information. So I love Scottish civil records for this very reason. Let's see what new information we can now put into our tree about John McCleary and his family. He was indeed born in the district of Bridgeton in the borough of Glasgow. And additionally, we have more details about his birth. It says 1959, May 21st at 6H0M, which means 6 hours, 0 minutes. And since they use the military time for the clock, not AM and PM, that would mean 6 a.m. We get the address of his birth location, which is likely his home for this time period. 21 Sister Street, Calton, Glasgow, which gives us a little more precise location for where they probably lived. We also have new information about his father's occupation, that he's a laborer. So to know which industry, we'd have a look at a history about the town to see what industries were nearby. So I'll often use Family Search Wiki for these types of research moments. So the father in the birth listing just below the McClearys, though, you can see is an operative cotton spinner. So it's possible that our Henry McCleary is a laborer in the cotton industry as well. We would want to check census records or birth records of John's siblings to find more details about the occupation. There is no additional information about the mother than we already had, since her maiden name was already visible in the indexed record on Family Search. However, this does confirm that her maiden name is Gemmel, and if you remember from a few minutes ago, her maiden name was not actually listed so it was listed here on Family Search in our indexed record, but it wasn't listed here on Scotland's People for some reason. Often you will see that right there, which helps you narrow down when you have a lot of results. So in this particular instance, we had more details about the parents on Family Search's index than we found on Scotland's People index, which is nothing about the parents. So in this case, that index on Family Search was actually super, super useful. So it just depends on the record. The informant of the birth was John's father, Henry, and this is his signature, which is awesome to see. You can tell because the handwriting is slightly different, and it doesn't just say his mark as in the entry below, right there where it's the mother and says her mark. So you know that he is literate and able to write. And you can also see that the birth was registered on June 2nd. Oops, didn't mean to quite go there yet. Registered on June 2nd at Glasgow by the assistant registrar right here. So that was about a week and a half after the birth happened. So you can see that we did learn some interesting clues about this family by checking these original images. But you can also see from this example that depending on what information you actually want, you may not always need to check the original record. In this case, there was enough in the Family Search Index to give us most of what we need when filling out a tree. The times when it's super important to check the original records is when you either want specific details about the family, or you suspect that some of the vital information is missing from the indexed entry, or when there seems to be an error in the extracted information, and you want to check the handwriting yourself. Also, if you are kind of stuck on somebody, sometimes going and looking at this additional information can give you some additional clues for getting some more records for that family. So it just depends what you're looking for. Spend your credits wisely and use the free indexes as much as possible. All right, that's it for today's overview of civil records. I hope this background information and walkthroughs was helpful. So just to recap, remember these important points when using civil records. The statutory records date from 1st January 1855, when civil registration was introduced in Scotland to replace the system overseen by the Church of Scotland. Registration of births, deaths, and marriages became compulsory from that date, regardless of religious denomination, and followed a standard format for each record type. Keep in mind, some old parish registers were kept after the introduction of civil registration for a while, so they are worth checking if you can't find a birth, death, or marriage that should have taken place in early 1855 or shortly thereafter. So when searching these statutory records, you should be able to find births, deaths, marriages, divorces, civil partnerships, and dissolutions for anyone who lived in Scotland, as long as they registered the event and the record survived. Indexes are free to search on Family Search and Scotland's People, and Ancestry or Find My Past, which we didn't review today. But if you'd like to see original images, you'll need to use Scotland's People credits to view the image, or order a certificate for events more recency than the privacy restricted dates. So lastly, as I always like to say, don't forget to have fun. There's so much valuable information in these civil registration records. I have absolutely loved learning about searching Scotland records because there's so much information. Often getting to one of these can really give you a lot of helpful information for finding that next stage of your research. So go forward and see what you can find. And that is it for today. So thank you.